Career coach Sarah Vermunt is here to help us understand workaholism and how to deal with it. So Sarah, let's start by defining it.
Yeah, so workaholism is when you have this compulsion to work outside of what's required, outside of reasonable hours. It's, it's like you can't turn off your work brain. You sort of feel drawn back to your work. Even though maybe there's a part of you that doesn't want to get drawn back to your work, you feel compelled to go back. And also, it interferes with the rest of your life. So it's interfering with your relationships, maybe with time with your family, maybe even sleep. So it's a big interfering factor in your life.
So for folks at home watching, this is more than just working a lot of hours. This is you can't get away from it. You are drawn back into it, right, Sarah?
Yeah, that's right. So it's normal to have, occasional spurts where work is crazy, right? Like let's say you're on deadline and you got to work a little extra then. It's also, unfortunately, sometimes normal in some industries for people to work just an insane amount of hours because that's the way the culture is, or to maybe work for a boss who has unrealistic expectations. None of that stuff is workaholism. So when the pressure is coming from outside of you because of internal factors. Workaholism is when the compulsion is coming from within you. So you're sort of dipping back into work and feeling like you don't have a lot of control over it because it's a compulsion. I once had a client ask me, do you think the problem is my job or is it me? And I thought that was a very insightful, self-aware question, because the truth is sometimes it's both, right? Like sometimes the problem isn't your job. And so just moving to another job isn't always the answer for people because of course we bring our behaviors with us, right? I like to think of our behaviors as an invisible backpack we strap on and take to work. And so we need to adjust some of those habits and behaviors if the issue is workaholism. Otherwise, we'll just take it to our new job.
Oh, that is an insightful question. So let's talk a little bit about the psychology. Why might workaholism happen? Why might you feel this compulsion to be working all the time, even if you don't really want to be working?
There's many reasons. I can talk about a few of them. For some people, their work is very much tied to their identity and their sense of value. So work for them kind of fills some sort of void. It's why they keep sort of being drawn back into their work. Another reason is that you might be using work to avoid something. So perhaps a relationship that isn't working is a good example. And I will raise my hand here as someone who struggled with that about 12 years ago. I was working all the time. I was in a relationship that didn't feel good. And so I just sort of poured myself into my work. None of that was conscious at the time, but with some distance, I realized it. Luckily now I'm divorced, much happier and working much less. Another reason you might be compelled to work all the time is because that was sort of conditioned into you in a previous job. Maybe you used to work in an industry that really burned you out. And so now you have these sort of like internalized behaviors just because you're used to doing that. Another reason some people are slipping into workaholism, some folks who have been working from home for a long time are slipping into this because there's really no separation of work and life. And so it feels really natural for them to answer the evening and weekend emails because that's the same space where they work during the day.
Absolutely. Like I feel lucky and privileged that I have the opportunity to work from home when I have to. On the other hand, I don't like it because there isn't that distinction. It's like here I'm always the mom and I'm always the worker and I'm always the wife. Now let's talk about dealing with this. So if you are a workaholic, how can people dealing with workaholism just start to combat it and get out of that?
Well, there's a few things that I can talk about briefly. One thing that's really important is to start examining your thoughts and your beliefs around work. The tricky thing about beliefs is they sort of run our lives on autopilot when we're not paying attention. So you'll want to ask yourself, what beliefs do I have about work? Most people who are workaholics have the belief I should be working all the time. It's that compulsion. So you want to ask yourself, why do I believe this sort of story in my head? Did somebody give me this belief? How is this belief working for the rest of my life? So just shining a little bit of light on the belief can sort of help to soften some of those behaviors. Another thing that's very practical and handy to do when you're trying to soften some of your workaholism behaviors is actually to plan activities that have some sort of external accountability outside of them, outside of work hours. So here's an example. I have a client who schedules workout classes with a friend, and she has to be there at a certain time at a certain place, and she pays for those classes in advance, and so it's a little less easy to skip. So if you can plan some activity outside of work hours where there's someone who's expecting you to be at a certain place at a certain time, that's very helpful. And then the last thing, and this is probably the hardest thing to do around workaholism, is resetting the expectations of others, your boss, your work colleagues around your behaviors. If you're a workaholic, you're probably really used to being accessible all the time, answering the late night phone calls, doing emails on the weekend. But let's say you want to shift those behaviors and you get a 9 p.m. email. You could go cold turkey and just not answer, but that's really hard for people who have workaholic tendencies. So instead, as a sort of starting point, what you can do is you can open the email and just acknowledge the receipt by saying something like, thanks for getting this on my radar. I've made a note of it, and I'm going to get to it first thing tomorrow morning. So resetting those expectations is a part of this.
Really good.